Women Voters and Common Cause Maryland. I'm Lynna Barnes from the League, the moderator tonight. Tonight's webinar begins with the premise that in order for a democracy to function, all citizens must have an equal opportunity and a clear right to vote. And elections must be fair, well-managed, and in service to voters. We've asked two leaders who are dedicated to furthering democracy to be panelists: Allison McLaughlin, an implementer of fair election practices, and Joanne Antoine, an advocate for fair election laws. But before I introduce the panelists and turn the meeting over to them, let's review some housekeeping details. First, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. The video recording will be available in a day or two on the League's YouTube channel. The web address is in the chat box. Secondly, both speakers will make their presentations. Then there will be a question and answer session for participants. Finally, we encourage you in the audience to ask questions. Click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the box, then hit send, return. We will answer as many questions as time allows. The program is scheduled to end at 8:30. Our first speaker is Allison McLaughlin, the Deputy Election Director of Montgomery County Board of Elections. Ms. McLaughlin's career began as an intergovernmental lobbyist. She served for several years on the National Association of Counties, representing counties in the Washington area. After leaving the association, Allison was part of the startup team for election initiatives with the Pew Center on the States. In 2009, on a dare, she accepted her first job in the trenches as an election administrator, helping to implement omnibus election reform legislation with the District of Columbia Board of Elections. In 2012, she moved to her current position as Deputy Election Director in Montgomery County. Ms. McLaughlin's experience with the Montgomery County Board of Elections makes her a valuable member of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Election Officials Technical Committee. Allison will talk to us about Montgomery County's 2020 primary and general election. And Joanne Antoine will be our second speaker. She joined Common Cause Maryland in January 2017, managing state operations and engagement for key policy campaigns, specifically around money in politics and voting rights. She now serves as the executive director of the organization, where she is responsible for creating and implementing policy campaigns and building capacity. Part of that capacity building has been forming partnerships with organizations like the League of Women Voters in advocating for common priorities around redistricting and election laws. Prior to joining Common Cause Maryland, Ms. Antoine worked for the Democracy Initiative, where she helped engage local, state, and national organizations in coalitions and advocacy campaigns in Maryland. She has also worked as an organizer, trainer, and strategist for numerous campaigns in the US and Haiti. So now we're going to begin with our speakers. It's my pleasure to invite Ms. McLaughlin to begin tonight's program.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue with you, and I really would like it to be a dialogue. So I'm going to keep my remarks on the shorter side so that we can move on to Joanne's presentation and then to the Q&A, because I really think that's where the most enjoyable parts of these conversations really come from. And I was asked to speak to give you sort of a bit of an insider's perspective to the 2020 election and the way that all sort of transpired with us. And so what I really like to do is to sort of divide the way that I speak to this in terms of the election that we planned for, the election that we asked for, and then the election that we ultimately were responsible for running. because those were really three different things. And the League of Women Voters, I know many of you have been very involved with us over the years. Many of you are election judges. Many of you do the polling place inspections for us. And, many of you pay a lot of attention to our board meetings. And so I know that, many of you know that we have a pretty far in advance planning process for the way that we run elections. We like a year in advance to have as much nailed down about the way an election is going to run as we possibly can. We have leases to put in place. We have people to hire. We have the curriculum to put together for our poll worker training. And we do it, with a relatively lean staff. We only have about 30 full-time employees in our office who are responsible year-round primarily for maintaining the voter registration database. And so it's really a pretty small crew that we have doing the operational aspect of event planning for, a large scale event. So we like to have as much as possible, nailed down as far in advance as we possibly can. And we were planning for a record turnout election. We were planning for a lot of people to show up at polling places across the county. We knew that long lines were an issue that everyone was paying attention to, that everyone was focused on. And so our planning process was really structured around trying to figure out how we could meet the expectations of voters, how we could provide for as satisfactory a voting experience as we could in our traditional polling place environment. And then, of course, with the early voting and vote by mail options that we've had now for many years. And then the pandemic happened. And I remember on Super Tuesday, I had the opportunity to speak as part of a panel on Capitol Hill and to discuss the way that we manage elections. And I was sitting next to two people who were both from Western states. And they were talking about their election process, and they were talking a lot about vote by mail. And I told the audience assembled there that I was their speaker from the East Coast. I was their speaker who was there from the Washington, D.C. area, and that we don't vote by mail here. We don't, that's not the kind of relationship that most of our voters are used to having with their government. It's much more of an in-person, face-to-face transaction. And a few weeks later, I was right there with my colleagues with the Maryland Association of Election Officials, drafting letters, placing calls, doing everything we could to try to really beg the decision makers in Annapolis to let us conduct an election as much by mail as possible, because we knew that the circumstances called for that, and we had to do something different. So the election that we asked to administer was really a 180 from the election that we had planned to run. And this was a very brief period of time. I mean, this was early March that I'm describing when Super Tuesday, and by the end of March, we knew that our April election wasn't going to happen on schedule, that it was going to happen in June, and that we were going to be running the election by mail, primarily by mail. And so that was a huge change right there. As we move forward, less so for the primary, but more so for the general election, the election that we then found ourselves administering was a completely different one than we had asked for, or than we had as the election administrators, or than we had planned around. And so the general election really became much more of a compromise exercise on the part of the governor and the state board, in trying to respond to a lot of the anxieties that people had, that voters had, that, a lot of different types of anxieties at that point, of course, with the worries about the Postal Service and, all of the concerns that were coming to bear. And so the general election was an entirely different situation. When I had planned for, and we did plan for these things, when we had planned for conducting an election in a pandemic, I certainly, my brain had focused on things like knowledge transfer. My brain had focused on things like election judges not showing up, people being ill. There were a lot of things about conducting an election in a pandemic that I did not fully appreciate. And the first of those was the anxiety that everyone would bring to the situation. And I mean, not just the anxiety of voters, but the anxiety of staff, the anxiety of decision makers, and really what I will go ahead and label as the institutional panic that set in, that resulted in a lot of second guessing and a lot of mind changing about what it was that that we could really ask of our democracy. And it was that exercise in having voters with anxieties and wanting to make sure that their own ballot was going to count, our anxieties about making sure that we were going to have the backup mechanisms in place to be able to handle all of the different scenarios that voters might show up in person, or they might vote by mail, or they might vote at this location or at that location. And then the decision makers in Annapolis, the leaders who really had the responsibility in the governor's mansion, at the state board of elections, for having to make a call about what we were going to do, not just what we were going to do in Montgomery County, but what we were going to do in Allegheny County, what we were going to do in the Eastern Shore, what we were going to do in all of the different areas of our state that had very different anxieties and very different demands. And so that's how we then ended up fast forwarding ahead to the general election with this model where voters were going to be able to go to every high school to be able to cast their ballot, because there were some just very quick decisions that decision makers needed to make at the state level about what was going to work statewide, not just what was going to work in Montgomery County, not just what was going to work in Baltimore City or Anne Arundel County, but what could they count on being available as a resource that was going to provide for that fairness across the state of what voters' options were going to be. And so I approach any kind of discussion or explanation of the 2020 election process from that perspective, from the fact that we had a lot of change, a lot of anxiety, a lot of solutions on top of solutions on top of solutions that resulted in these short-term decisions about what was going to be best for the voters, not just in Montgomery County, but in the state. And I got to say that I am just so incredibly proud of what we did. I started off saying that, we like to plan in advance. And it really felt in the thick of conducting the election, especially the general election, like we were doing two impossible things before breakfast. And then we needed to start answering the phones and explaining what was going on to voters. That was really, I think, as we recover from the 2020 election, as we move forward into planning for the 2022 election, and I know Joanna's going to speak next to the decisions that the legislature has just made about how we're going to be conducting the 2022 election. And I don't want to steal her thunder, but we're not keeping all of these aspects of what we did in 2020. There's some things that are going to stick. There's some things that we're going to build on. But there's a lot that we're kind of going to reset and go back to the way it was in 2018. But voters have changed and opinions have changed. Our own staff's understanding of our capabilities and what we can do have changed. And so I'm excited about what lies ahead. We can get into, in the Q&A, we can get into some of the sort of specific aspects of the voter experience in the primary and in the general election as much as your audience would like. But I wanted to set the tone by just sort of telling you about how we experienced that constant change as we were navigating the same kinds of anxieties and uncertainties as the rest of the world about, can we work remotely? If we work in person, what if we're struggling to figure out how to stay 6 feet away from each other as we perform these tasks? It was an environment in which there was a lot that was unknown, but we knew what our core values were. And we knew that our core values came down to conducting an election that the show must go on, and conducting an election that ensured that every voter not only had that equal opportunity to vote, but that we also were doing everything we could to communicate out what needed to be done. Dr. Z, I know many of you know Hilberto Zelaya in our office, and he was breaking all kinds of laws of physics, being on 3 different Zoom calls simultaneously, to get the word out. But even we, the phones can only be answered as often as you have phones in the building to answer them. And so, voters would be on hold. Voters had a lot of anxieties. Were we going to reject their ballot because their signature looked different than the last time they signed something, which we weren't. But voters were very worried about that. And so it was invaluable that we had the League. It was invaluable that we had Common Cause. It was invaluable that we had so many individuals and organizations that were multiplying our voice, that were doing the homework to understand our processes and help us communicate them out to voters. And so I'll end with that thank you to you, that thank you to all of you. I'll let Joanne go on, and then in the Q&A, we can get into some of your more specific questions about the election.
Thank you, Allison. That really was informative. And I have to say, we all want to thank you too, because I have to say, I was astonished with the results, all the work that went into those 2 elections, because it was just so different than anything we'd seen. And I have a daughter in Chicago who was working elections, and they weren't changing theirs that much. They were really pretty much doing it the same old way with fewer places. So you guys did a phenomenal job. But thank you so much for your presentation. We're now going to go on to Joanne Antoine, who is here from Common Cause. And she, as Allison said, she's going to tell us about some of the things that the legislature did. So Joanne, I turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Lena, and to the MoCo League of Women Voters for inviting me to join this evening. As you all know, the League, both local and statewide, are core partners in our work. So special shout out to Janet, if she's on today, who is was my co-conspirator this session. And also thank you to Allison for the work that you do. I think, when we look at the 2020 election, I think the least amount of complaints that we got were from MoCo. I think, you all are kind of ahead in terms of technology, just being able to text, and get links to different resources. We referred to all of that during session as we were trying to improve things like tracking and so forth. So thank you for all that you do, and hopefully those best practices will be replicated throughout the state. Now I'm going to share my screen. We had surprisingly a lot of victory this session. And I say surprisingly, just remembering that, we were going into session. I don't know if you all can see. Hold on 1 second. We were going into session, for the first time having to navigate it remotely. I hope that you all can see the correct version and not the presenter version. Hopefully you can.
I think it's the presenter's version, but that's okay. I mean, I can certainly read it.
Yeah, I'm not clear what's happening. Let me try one more time. Sorry, you all. Technology never works the way that we need it to. Still presenter version, or it's okay?
Excellent job.
Yes. So just thinking about, outside of just coming out of the 2020 election, where we know that, voters overwhelmingly voted by mail, largely because they needed to. And I think we got an opportunity to show the General Assembly that vote by mail has the potential to increase participation all throughout the state. Now, if anyone has paid attention to some election bills in the past, Senator Kramer, for example, has had a bill for years to just study vote by mail, and we couldn't even get that to move. But coming into this session, we were already hearing from legislators who wanted to introduce bills to move forward with vote by mail. So there was already change happening happening within the General Assembly. But I think for us, the concern was, how do we navigate not being there in person to kind of ensure that the bill is written well, that changes aren't being made that may somehow indirectly disenfranchise voters. So we kind of quickly shifted strategy, right? We decided to instead focus on ways to improve the mail-in voting process in hopes that we can move to a vote by mail program coupled with in-person voting in the future. So I'm going to cover a few of our victories. Now, early voting centers. If you remember here in Montgomery County, I think it's been 2 years now, or the last election, where we were working to try to get an additional vote center. Now that was a debate for a long time. I featured a picture here of the White Oak Recreation Center, just because this was one of the areas where we were trying to get a vote center. You know, White Oak has a lot of new Americans, new citizens, mostly from the continent of Africa, who were experiencing a lot of issues trying to get down to the Silver Spring Vote Center. So Delegate Ludke had actually introduced a bill last year. It was a local bill, but we ran out of time. And this year he decided to take a different approach. He instead has changed the formula for determining the number of vote centers that jurisdictions get. So Montgomery County, for example, going into the 2022 election, will have 2 additional vote centers. And I think what's critical here, outside of there being just the 2 locations, the General Assembly is requiring that we're taking into account, you know, where voters historically have been disenfranchised, right? Where making sure that vote centers are close to public transportation, areas with dense populations of voters, and so forth. So that was a major win. I know that MoCo local board has already, you know, the process already allows for public input, but I think hopefully more communities, you know, will have greater access to early voting because there'll be a location that's closer to them. Another bill that we had passed this session was championed by both Delegate Washington and Senator Washington, both from Prince George's and Baltimore City. This changes the opening time for early voting locations. So when we think about a presidential election, early voting centers would open at 8 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. Now in a gubernatorial election, they opened later, opening at 10 a.m. Now this might not seem like a huge difference for folks, but you know, when you're thinking about voters who work in the morning, who maybe are commuting out of the county or maybe even out of the state into DC, you know, it might be that an 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. works best for them. So again, just providing voters with the greatest amount of time to vote early as early voting grows more popular. Now, I talked a lot about the election bill, the mail-in voting bills. These bills changed so much during session. I think we started off, our priority bills were House Bill 1047, House Bill 1048, and House Bill 1235. They all kind of incorporated different pieces from, you know, establishing a permanent mail-in voting list to things like tracking and curing, and even, you know, looking to redesign our mail-in voting envelopes, testing for usability and use of plain language. Now the House moved all of our bills, the House of Delegates. Where we run into problems, unfortunately, happened to be in the Senate. So what the Senate decided to do was kind of take our priority bill, which is championed by Delegate Wilkins, and the Senate bill is Senator Kramer, and focused in on 1048. Now, what House Bill 1048 does is it makes secure drop boxes a permanent staple in our elections. We know that even when we looked at the general election and the primary, those voters who voted by mail overwhelmingly used drop boxes as their, you know, method for returning their ballot. And they've even gone so far as to ensure that drop boxes are placed in a manner where, let's say the voter who has a disability, who is coming to the drop box in a wheelchair, that it's not placed on a curb where it's inaccessible to them. It establishes a permanent mail-in voting list. And what this does is it ensures that the voter who regularly votes by mail, either because they need to or because they like the convenience, that they're able to opt into continuously to automatically receiving their mail-in ballot in the future. There are provisions in there that ensure that, let's say a ballot is returned, that individual is removed from that list. One other big piece that's included in there that we actually did not ask for, this was Senator Pinsky. Again, there was a lot of excitement for mail-in voting in the Senate, and he wanted to see if we can continue to increase participation throughout the state. So we're going to be mailing out ballot request forms to all active, I believe it's all active voters, both in the 2022 and 2024 primary. Obviously, this is going to exclude voters who have opted into the permanent list. And just some other provisions in there, testing for usability. We want to ensure that the voter who is using a mail-in ballot, that they're voting the way that they intend, that they hopefully, understand that they need to sign the oath, and the precinct level reporting, which, was an issue in the last election. This is largely for candidates more than anything. So many bills. One other big one, that this is a priority both for us and for the League of Women Voters. Obviously, this is an effort that is led by formerly incarcerated individuals, advocates. So groups like Out for Justice, Life After Release, Maryland Justice Project, have been working over the last few years to ensure that voters who are currently incarcerated and eligible to vote, so this would be voters who are serving time for misdemeanors on pretrial, that they have access to mail-in voting information and the forms. Now, this bill, Value My Vote Act, started off really robust. I think one lesson that came out of the 2020 general, especially since the state board worked with partners, advocates to try and get materials into the correctional facilities, knowing that we didn't have access, obviously, because of the pandemic, but even more so because we don't know what happens to the materials once they get inside, right? We can only trust that a ballot is making it into a voter's hands. So what we really wanted to do was kind of add some additional provisions, right? So giving them access to a free hotline, keeping in mind that anyone who's making a call from inside a facility, they're paying by minute. So it was critical that the hotline be free. We know that there might not be someone who picks up on the other end when they call. So ensuring that the voter is able to leave a message and just report issues of intimidation or anything like that inside of a facility. We wanted to make drop boxes available at least at the larger correctional facilities. So this would include Baltimore City, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Baltimore County, at least the larger places. There was a bill, Senate Bill 525, that does provide the Baltimore City facility with a drop box, but unfortunately, that provision was striked from the bill. And just some other important pieces: when you're incarcerated, there were concerns about the amount of time it takes for a ballot to go, or any election materials to go into a facility, actually get into that voter's hand and come back out in a timely manner. So we wanted to ensure that correction staff was sorting the mail and prioritizing any election related mail. So again, this was a victory. It at least requires that the state board and the correctional agency, that they work together to implement a program, that there's reporting and that there's signage inside, and more importantly, that the voter who is returning home, that they are aware that their rights are restored. But we'll probably be coming back next session with more on this. And I won't go into this as much, but again, I think the theme this session, well, I guess it's always access, but more importantly, ensuring that a voter has access to vote regardless of where they reside. So if that's in a correctional facility or on campus, historically turnout amongst young people here in the state, unfortunately, is low. We work a lot with the 4 HBCUs throughout the state, and I think the theme that we've seen, especially at campuses like Coppin, for example, is that there isn't any robust voter effort on campus that's supported by the administration. So this bill, adds a few provisions that ensure everything from a campus having to establish a vote coordinator on campus who is going to work with student orgs, to ensuring that something like the online voter registration form that is clear and easy to find. We actually during session went through some of the school's websites, and it's concerning how far you have to search just to land on a page, that has basic voter info. So this at least ensures that young people and those who are serving, our country, that they are able to easily register and vote. And, just some quick honorable mentions. These are bills that unfortunately did not make it through. House Bill 1047, the Mail-in Voting Enhancement Act, which started off as our big bill. At the very last minute, it unfortunately, died on sine die. It did pass in both chambers, but there was some disagreement on the number of days that we should allow for canvass. And, we initially supported 18 days, but the House didn't think it was necessary. So we were trying to reach a compromise, but there just wasn't enough time. Ranked choice voting. I know this is a Montgomery County specific bill. It was supported by the delegation, but I think with any major election change, it is going to take a lot of public education and mobilizing here. And I think with a huge change like ranked choice voting, even with the delegation's support, I think it's going to take a lot of public pressure and a few years, unfortunately, to move that forward. I think some other bills that you all might have heard of, House Bill 655, which was all over the news for a few days. Again, just thinking about some of these southern counties and the way that they elect their commissioners. The district commissioners are elected in their at-large candidates. So this would really just ensure that voters who live in the district are, selecting the people who represent them in the district. And I think another big one, the theme that we saw during the 2020 election was around accessibility for voters with disabilities. I think when we looked at the vote centers, people just weren't aware what assistance was available to them. They didn't know that there was a placeholder program, for example. So we had a few bills that would have ensured that things like signage were made available, but they unfortunately died in the Senate. So, even with these bills dying, we've made some huge changes that will surely, set us on path to establishing a vote by mail program in the state, and will hopefully lead to more people voting by mail in 2022. I know that was a mouthful, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. It's really a pleasure to have you. And actually, I know the people in the league who were working with Common Cause were really, really happy with the partnership that it existed. It really, I think working together with another group really makes amplifies your voices. And we at the league, I know, appreciate this, and I hope Common Cause was happy with that too. So we're going to now move on to the next portion of the program, and it's time to move on to your questions. I know there's some questions that have already been put into the Q&A box, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm going to turn this portion over to Amelia Brust, who is going to be our question and answer moderator. It's yours, Amelia.
Thanks, Lina. So yes, once again, if you have a question for either of our panelists, please just put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. And if your question is directed to a particular panelist, we just ask that you specify that to make it clearer. But our first question is probably best for Allison, which is something that I suspect a lot of us are wondering, and that is, what election procedures implemented in 2020 do you see being carried over into the 2022 election?
The two big things that I see coming out of 2020 were in the legislation. And one is the drop boxes. And the other is really related to that. The other is the sort of the combination of the permanent absentee list and the requirement that absentee ballot applications go out prior to the two primary elections in 2022 and in 2024. And so I think the combined effect of those two is going to be that it is going to create incentives. It's going to create an encouraging environment for voters to feel comfortable going ahead and continuing to vote by mail, and knowing that that support structure is going to be there. Those drop boxes are a very visible indication to voters that we are here to receive those ballots and to count them. And so I think that vote by mail, I certainly do expect the percentage of voters who are voting by mail I don't think it's going to be as high as 2020 was, certainly, but I think it's going to be a good bit higher than 2018 was. Now, of course, we didn't end up getting the authority to open ballots any earlier than we did in 2018. So that's going to be a lot of ballots for us to count on the back end of the process. And we're working with the state to try to see if we can get our hands on sorting equipment and, some other things to make that process more efficient. It was certainly a frustration that you had sort of, is it going to be 7 days before? Is it going to be 18 days before? And then somewhere in the middle, we landed at 0. So, but we'll keep working on that.
And I'll just add, it's funny too, because in the House, we had at the start of session, there were a few different bills that all called for an early canvass. And then, leadership just kind of changed their position quickly. The committee chair, recommended 14 days. So for us to go to 0, unfortunately, I'm hoping that we can get something through next session, even if it's 3 days, but we're trying.
Well, then, as a quick follow-up, if you foresee more mail-in ballots coming in the future, do you think that would lead the Board of Elections to change anything about the way those ballots are made, or the types of envelopes or delivery methods that are accepted for getting all of those in, especially since that process depends so much on the Postal Service and Postal Service delivering on time to get those ballots counted as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I can't really speak for the State Board of Elections and the decisions that they're going to need to make about that. There was a time when we mailed out the ballots from our office, and we haven't done that in several cycles now. The state uses a single vendor to print and then mail out ballots centrally. So we kind of take them in on the receiving end, but it'll be up to the State Board of Elections to decide what I do think they did some really good things with envelope design this time. I think they were, responsive to people's concerns and questions about data on their information being on their signature in particular being on the envelope. And so the flaps were a response to that. The color coding was a response to that, helped us and helped voters as well. There are a couple of requirements in the legislation as it came out as well, but I think I kind of need to wait and see what the state board is going to say about the ultimate ballot design. Or envelope design, pardon me.
And do you mind just sort of clarifying what is the mail-in voter permanent list? Who gets this list, and how exactly is it generated, and how is it kept? How is it saved?
Sure. Yeah, we kind of use some shorthand there. What this is going to look like is that when the voter applies for an absentee ballot, and that application is still going to exist much like it exists now, where the voter needs to request that ballot, whether they do it online or whether they do it using a paper form. The application is going to change, and there's going to be a new section on the application where, in addition to saying, I want to receive a ballot sent to me and I want it by mail, or I want to download it from the internet, they are now going to also receive a choice there of whether right now, you can say, I just want it for one cycle, or you can say that I want it for both the primary and the general elections this year. There will be another option. And that additional option will be to say, I want to vote by mail from this point forward. And what we've seen looking at other states around the country is that this has kind of been step in the evolution toward a more vote by mail based system that a lot of states have gone through, where they went from having a predominantly in-person experience to having more and more and more of their voters sign up to be on a permanent by mail list. And so this is, probably going to be consistent with what we've seen in other states, where as more people opt in to being on that permanent by mail list, then our system will probably slowly move to be more by mail oriented. But it's up to the voter. The voter will have to choose, and it'll be on the ballot application where you say, I want to receive my ballot once, twice, or, now on. The way that the bill was written, voters will get a mailing from us. They'll be contacted by us. It might be by mail. It might be in other ways that they specify in their application. But voters who opt into this permanent list are going to be contacted by our office prior to each election to say, hey, you're on our permanent list. Do you still want to be on it? Has any of your information changed? Do you want to receive it differently? And if a voter does not return that ballot for 2 federal election cycles, then they actually will drop off of the permanent list. They'll still be registered to vote, but they'll drop off of that permanent list if they haven't actually used it in 2 election cycles.
Great, thank you. The next question deals with the requests for mail-in ballots. In the primary election, I believe ballots were sent automatically to all registered voters, but then in the general, voters had to first request a mail-in ballot. And this created some confusion or possible duplicate efforts and delays in sending and or receiving either document. So is there anything being done at this point to limit future confusion or possible duplication of efforts?
Joanne might want to speak to the discussions that went on in the legislature about this. I think this question was really grappled with very seriously by legislators in this last session. But the decision was clear. The decision was clearly made that we're not mailing ballots to everyone. We're only mailing ballots out on request. And so, hopefully having a clear answer on that will help resolve voters' confusion. Joanne, I don't know if you wanted to comment more on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just think there's still, even with the success of the 2020 election, there's still a lot of concerns about moving to a full vote by mail program. I mean, I've met with a lot of members of the House in particular, where the fear is that we might disenfranchise Black and Brown voters or people who, are lower income or who move around a lot. I think that there's ways that we can do it, again, when it's coupled with expansive in-person voting options, maybe even looking at shifting to the vote center model and increasing the number of days that we have. It wasn't a concern for us, but I think we just need to continue to show the General Assembly, beyond the pandemic, that voters can safely vote by mail and have their voices heard. Yeah, I was also going to make another comment, but I won't. But, again, just thinking about the 2020 election, everyone wanted ballots automatically mailed in the general. Unfortunately, and this is from election officials to advocates to members of the public, unfortunately, the governor made the decision that he thought was in the best interest of voters. But yeah, we are looking at ways to at least make the process of requesting a ballot possibly more seamless, especially if you're using the online process.
Yeah, I think the state board heard loud and clear that the visual similarity between the envelope that the absentee ballot application came out looking like in the general election and the envelope that came out with the ballot itself, there were people who thought that the envelope that was sitting on their dining room table was their ballot when it was an application inside. And so they definitely heard that loud and clear. And I don't think that that will be quite so similar looking in the future. The confusion that I am personally most worried about right now, and really look forward to working with all of you to grapple with as we talk to voters moving into the 2022 cycle, is confusion about what the in-person options look like. I definitely, we see now people who voted early in one location will just assume that they can vote there on election day in the next election. And so people who went to a high school, maybe it was the first time they ever voted this time, or, maybe they moved, or maybe they just assume this is what it's going to be like, now and forever. They went to that high school, they voted at that high school. Now they show up and there's voting happening at that high school, but it's not their polling place. And so they're not going to be on the list there. They're going to have to vote a provisional ballot. It may not be the ballot with the right contest that they're actually eligible to vote in, over on the another part of the county. So that confusion and kind of getting across to people that we're back to an election model where there is an assigned polling place on election day, that was something we were already struggling with. And I think we're going to struggle with that even more in 2022. It's going to have to be a big focus of our messaging.
I didn't even think of that. But now that you say that, again, thinking about the 2020 election, I think the thing that was unique there was that a lot of investment was made in public education, especially as we went into the general. And I don't think we had any of those conversations during session, but I do think ensuring that both the local and state boards are equipped with enough funding to lead a robust public education campaign like we had in 2020, I think will be critical, even as we're thinking about vote centers and where people end up on election day.
Thank you. Our next question, I think I'm going to go with one that is directed more towards Joanne, but Allison, you can certainly answer it as well. How many other states at this point are seeing laws which have the potential to restrict or suppress voters? And is Maryland possibly one of those states that could have upcoming legislation which makes it harder for people to cast a vote?
Yeah, I want to say it's every single state. The Brennan Center actually, had put out a report. We had over 360 bills pop up, everything, from voter ID bills to wanting to address ballot harvesting. I think this session was unique for us. This is the most coordinated I've ever seen the Republicans. And obviously we say this is a nonpartisan org. We work with Republicans on election bills as well. But I'd say this session in particular, everything from the press conference to bills like the Integrity Act, popping up here in Maryland are similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the country. I think we're lucky where, our General Assembly, even, thinking about Delegate Wilkins, who's our election subcommittee chair, we're not too concerned about those types of bills moving. But again, I think it's a coordinated effort that is, in every single state.
One idea that has been suggested in the national conversation around voting access and election day access is possibly making election day a national holiday. Is that something that either of you see as a possibility in the near future or within the next couple election cycles?
Joanne, do you all have a position on that one?
I mean, we, in theory, support it. It's not something that we champion, right? Our goal is ensuring that more people vote before election day, and ensuring that voters can do things like register on the same day and so forth. So I think for us, it's not a priority, but it's not something we would oppose either.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go ahead and say there are certainly pros and cons to any number of different proposals about how to change the election process. One of the things that is used in other states in arguing for why we need election day to be a holiday is so the schools will be out. And thankfully, Maryland has been ahead of the game on that one. And so we already have the schools out on election day. So we get that administrative benefit. I do hear worries sometimes that if we had a holiday on election day, that we'd get family vacations during the election weekend, and that we would struggle to have election judges, that we would have more voters sort of maybe leaving town, maybe not as focused on voting. And so I know there have been a really a variety of different perspectives, pro and con on that one.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, what are both of your expectations at this point for the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission and the maps that they will submit to the General Assembly in January. But then also at the Montgomery County level, how do you expect redistricting to affect voting precincts?
Well, I'll start with that one, and Joanne, you can chime in if you want. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know where the lines are going to be. What I do know is that we are going to find out what those lines are really close to the election. We're going to be way into our planning process. And so it's going to be a very quick turnaround for those lines then there's a step that has to happen after those lines are formally decided upon, which is that at our board level, we're going to have to adjust the precinct boundaries to match. And our own board is going to have to give public notice of those boundaries. There's time that needs to be put into that process of making sure those boundaries are well understood and that there's buy-in on those. And then we also have to match each one up with a polling place. And those decisions affect the way our voting machines need to be programmed. They need to affect how many ballots we order for the makeup of that precinct, how many we pack and ship. And so there are a lot of operational things that need to happen that are going to happen in a very compressed time frame. And so, that's thankfully, I guess our 2020 experience proved that we can do some of these things maybe a little faster than we thought we could before, but it's going to be tight. It's going to be a really fast turnaround.
Yeah, and I would say for the statewide redistricting commission, I would keep in mind first that we as a state are really behind. So the additional 6 commissioners were only just announced, I want to say on Friday, right? And, even for the new commissioners, they're still, they still need to figure out what their plan is going to look like in terms of public outreach and allowing for public input. I know they plan on having national experts come and brief them on best practices. So I think for folks at home, it's just really making sure you're keeping an eye out for the dates for when you can, attend one of the briefings and provide input. I know the League of Women Voters and Common Cause will be working together on our Fair Maps campaign to get members of the community to do community-centered mapping. But I think, especially if you're someone who's thinking of running for office, just keeping in mind that things like the candidate filing deadline, which right now I believe is in February, that date is probably going to have to be moved back, right? In order for for our maps to be drawn on time, but for the state and local boards to prepare and so forth. So I think a lot of this is going to be reactive, unfortunately, due to the census data coming in so late.
Thank you. Our next question is kind of a combination of questions I see here in the Q&A. Election security and voter fraud are things that we heard a lot about last year, but these are topics and concerns that come up pretty much every single election cycle. So would you mind possibly just kind of giving an overview of how in the county and in the state election officials maintain the security of ballots, and both mail-in ballots and in-person ballots cast, and what the general process is for making sure that the list of registered voters is accurate and updated and correct.
Right, let me see how short an answer I can give to that question. I think the first thing for me to emphasize is that these concerns are not new and the solutions to them are not new. I would say that since 2016, there's certainly been a lot more emphasis on the kinds of threats that are posed in the cyber realm and the kinds of threats that come from foreign nation states at our process. But when you look back at the history of how elections are managed and why they're structured the way they are, we have bipartisan teams of election judges for reasons, because the threats to the integrity of the process have historically been viewed as being closer to home, being candidates and their allies, being insider threats, the physical security of ballots themselves and ballot boxes. And so the security mindset that needs to be applied to elections, but really needs to be applied, in the cyber realm generally, is something that is no stranger to the elections process and is no stranger to our processes. Having a statewide voter registration database is something that, there's been plenty of attention to, as well. We have certainly between electronic voting machines, the voter registration database, we've had enough concerns that have been raised over the years about things being electronic and being intangible in that sense, that I really think that both at the county level and more importantly, really at the state level, there's been a need to respond to those concerns. I mean, going back to having the electronic voting machines implemented after the 2000 election, these are not new. These are concerns that we have sort of well-established and documented best practices, that are followed. But I would say that certainly since 2016, especially in the cyber realm, we've had to really step up our game, but really step up in ways that are, that are matched to the sophistication of the threats. And so we did not have two-factor authentication, until just a few years ago, but we do now. We have now had two-factor authentication that has been required. I need to do two-factor authentication to get into my email, let alone to get into the statewide voter registration database. The federal funds that have been spent have gone really quite heavily toward making sure that we short up the statewide voter registration database and making sure that there's really sort of state-of-the-art protections that are in place, monitoring that's in place. The really good thing that I would like to emphasize is that Montgomery County is a sophisticated, large county. We have a lot of other kinds of government databases that contain, honestly, a whole lot more information about you and me than your voter file. And so we have very sophisticated work that already exists in our Department of Technology Services to protect our IT infrastructure. And the same is true with the state of Maryland. So we have the benefit of having all the resources that would go into, securing IT infrastructure in the first place, that is then also now increasingly applied to and coordinated with what we do on the election side as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question, does or can the Board of Elections play any sort of proactive or advocacy role with regards to ranked choice voting, or is the board's role purely to react to and implement whatever is enabled on ranked choice voting in the legislature?
The latter. I'm a county employee. I run elections, the way that we're told to run them, whatever that may be. Now, there are certainly times and situations where we will engage in legislative matters, where our association of the Maryland Association of Election Officials will take votes and we'll speak up on things. Our county board, the state board will weigh policy matters. But for the most part, we, certainly on some of these questions about the voting methods, we'll weigh in on what the administrative considerations are that should be taken into account, what it's going to cost. We write a fiscal note for the bills. But that's, ultimately it's really up to the legislature to decide matters like that.
I second everything Allison said. I'd say obviously the state provides input, on bills that we're working on, but I think this is going to take grassroots pressure, right? If we are changing a process that voters are using, it needs to be the voters that are making the case to members of the General Assembly. And I think to the RCV for Maryland coalition to address concerns that they might have. And I know that unfortunately, again, when we're thinking about changing methods in this way, there's concerns just around the public education, right? If we shift to this, how do we ensure that, this messaging of RCV being easy as 1, 2, 3, is it that easy for the voter, and so forth. So I think, again, there's just unfortunately going to have to be a learning curve here for the General Assembly and for the public.
Great, thank you. Our next question, was any legislation or processes, approved in this session affecting registration of high school students? Or is there any way to expedite this?
I'm trying to think. Joanne, can you think of anything that was directly to high school voter registration this session?
No, I don't even think we had anything that impacted voter registration at all, outside of, the colleges having the link on their website and so forth. I don't think there was anything. Yeah.
We do. I mean, I'll put in a bit of a plug again for Dr. Z, for Gilberto Zelaya in our office, who coordinates our outreach effort and reaching out to the high schools, making sure that we get in front of high school students is something that is, very important to him, very important to our office, both in the sense of registering voters and making sure that voters are aware of that opportunity, young voters are aware of that opportunity, but also it's a great group of recruits for us, both for the younger students for our Future Vote program, and then for the older students. My daughter was 17, so she got to work for the first time in this last election cycle, and she was there manning that table for Dr. Z at our high school early this year before the pandemic.
And I know that, I don't know if it was last session or in 2019, but there was a bill, at the request of Montgomery County high school students, that would have made it where National Voter Registration Day, which would have been at the start of school, that all of the high schools were doing voter registration activities inside. I know there were concerns about the day, whether or not it was feasible at the start of school. There were concerns about who would be allowed to go into the high school. And even thinking about some of the high schools, you'd be surprised, debates about tables and whether or not there's enough tables for voter registration. So I think if there are high schoolers on here who want to kind of bring back that bill, I'm sure us and the League of Women Voters would be happy to support and help you find a new sponsor.
Great, thank you. You also did mention the volunteering aspect of this past election cycle, and the plea that went out for people to work as poll workers this last cycle was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And I was one of those first-time poll workers this last election cycle, and it was a very interesting experience. So I actually want to ask a couple questions about that. The first one being, looking at the next, maybe at the next midterm election and the next presidential election, what is the hope or even the need that the county foresees for poll workers, assuming that we will not be in another pandemic situation where the usual group of volunteers is choosing to stay home, but also more people will not be at home all day and may not have the physical flexibility to work at the polls that time around. I'd be curious to know how the Board of Elections is planning for that possibility.
Our normal rhythm for election judge interest levels, corresponds with voter interest. And so normally when it's not a pandemic, in say a gubernatorial primary election, we'll be begging. We will really be, checking around every corner, trying to find people and, going to every school to say, please, pretty please, we need you. For a presidential general election, we often do have a lot more people who are interested in serving as election judges than we need. Our biggest challenge in that presidential general election is getting people in the door early enough so that we can get them through the training process before election day. Because those people who contact our office, maybe a week before election day, we don't have any training classes left for them. And so that's our normal rhythm, really struggling to find enough people in a gubernatorial primary, and then just struggling with the presidential general election volume to get people in the door early so that we can get those training classes full so that we can send enough people through them to meet the demand that we're going to have. This last time, boy, and this really wasn't in the scope of your question, but I just sort of feel the need to point out that we didn't know, at least, that the level of interest was going to be there that ultimately was. A lot of the way that the 2020 election was structured, a lot of the decisions that the State Board of Elections made were because they had a very real fear that we were going to have a worker shortage. Now that ultimately was overcome by the extent of the interest that we saw in a way that was enormously gratifying, and definitely made our jobs a lot easier than we thought they were going to be in that sense. But I think that it's more that we didn't see as much of the aberration as we expected. So I think the rhythm is still there. That level of enthusiasm was much closer to what we would have expected in a presidential general election than we thought it would be. So looking ahead to the 2022 gubernatorial primary, we fully expect to be right back where we were in trying to find people who are willing to work, whether that was the 2018 primary or the 2014 primary. And so we're really kind of grateful to have this enormous list of newer and younger workers who signed up, some of whom weren't able to work in the 2020 general election because we're going to need them in 2022.
So another question I have about that is with regards to the training that you had to put together for those poll workers. I remember just going through my training session at the County Transportation Center.
Mm-hmm.
The video and the worksheet that we had to go through to learn how to operate the ballot counting machines, I was astounded by the level of detail and like little tiny things that the Board of Elections had to take into account to craft those guides and those tutorials and those videos. But is there anything that you foresee the county having to maybe changing for the next election as it crafts those training materials? And if they're working with different locations next election cycle, what it's going to take to plan out in advance, where machines can be placed and where, tables and areas can be designated, and then that will be put into the training materials to explain to poll workers.
Yeah, it's, on the one hand, you want to assume that we're going to be able to go back to the way things were, and that we're not going to need to account for masks and social distancing and plexiglass. And, we're not quite there where we can say 100% that we don't have to worry about those things. And so that's, that's still very much kind of in the back of our minds, the what ifs and what are the, I truly think that people's concepts of personal space, if nothing else, have changed at least somewhat over the course of the last year. So there is that, there's COVID to take into consideration, and what that's going to mean for training classes. The way that we would have done this prior to 2020, we would have had a lot of hands-on group work where you and another group of people would all be clustered around, the same machine, seeing what's on the screen with your heads, kind of close to each other. And that was what we had to avoid in preparing for the 2020 election. We had the challenge of distancing, and then we also had the challenge of space, because our building has training rooms that were used for conducting most of our training classes in 2018 and prior. And in 2020, our entire building was converted to be an envelope warehouse at all the different stages that in a data entry zone. So, you know, we do have to take into consideration the COVID piece. We do have to take into consideration what the level of interest is going to be in vote by mail and the extent to which we're going to be able to turn our training spaces back to training spaces again. But for the most part, I think that the one thing that really came out of the 2020 training experience for workers was that I think the online training was popular. I do think that we've always had an online component. I shouldn't say always, but we've had an online component for a very long time. But that really expanded this time. People seem to like it, especially people who were longtime election judges who, you know, do this year after year and sometimes feel like, you know, why do I have to go to the Board of Elections all day? You know, they were able to get that refresher class online on their own schedule. So I do think that a lot of those, a lot of the things about online training that were desirable for workers are going to continue to be desirable for workers. There's definitely an interest on the part of our own staff to do more of an online emphasis, but I think we're always going to have that in-person component because you've got to touch and feel, you know, and operate the voting equipment in order to be confident on election day. About the detail, though, that you mentioned, all those little, you know, forms and seals and accurately transcribing the serial numbers off of things. There's your election security right there. That's a, you know, a huge part of our chain of custody requirements and the, you know, the documentation to make sure that we've, you know, that things haven't been tampered with. So thank you for doing the work.
Thank you. Our next question is maybe best directed to Joanne. Do you see the possibility of any emergency legislative changes being introduced at the beginning of the 2022 legislative session that could affect election procedures?
Emergency legislative. I mean, all of the legislative changes that we had happened this session because we're still, you know, in the middle of a pandemic. I'm not sure what 2021 is going to look like. Our hope is that we will have access, some level of access to the buildings. But yeah, honestly, we won't know what 2021 looks like until we get closer. I think the one thing we are going to be advocating for, hopefully, I think the one positive that came out of this is that we've expanded or increased access to Annapolis. We know that a lot of times we hear from folks who want to come out and testify, who can't drive out to Annapolis, who don't have, you know, access to public transportation to come out there. So being able to upload your written testimony online, provide oral testimony from home. It's great now that you can watch floor debates, which honestly changes all of it compared to listening to audio. I think a lot of these features are things that we want to kind of ensure, you know, are permanent moving forward. But again, I'm not expecting emergency changes. It might just be that there's limited capacity or that we can't hang out in things like the lounge. You know, we're coming in just for meetings or just testifying. But yeah, too early to know.
Generally, we warn that there's reason for caution on making any legislative changes that affect the election in the year of an election, because there is so little time in between sine die and the election date. And we are well underway in training election judges by the time we can count on any legislation, you know, even coming to a vote. So, you know, I suppose, you know, you can never say never that something might be considered or, but the difference between the kind of tweak that can just sort of be implemented behind the scenes and the kind of change to law that has to affect our planning, requires regulations to be written, requires curriculum to be written, requires election judges to be trained. It's really too late by the time we get to the legislative session to really properly implement those kinds of changes.
Thank you. Our next question, how often are voting rolls expunged, and what are the typical reasons they need to be expunged?
So list maintenance isn't an all or nothing thing that happens one day to your record. The word expunged is not a word that we used. We have these incredibly technical words. We inactivate the voter. Generally speaking, a voter registers to vote. They remain registered to vote until or unless we receive word from a trustworthy government source. And we're talking about the Motor Vehicle Administration. We're talking about another state where that voter moved and registered to vote. We're talking about death records. We're talking about the Social Security death index. So if we get, say, a Social Security death record that comes through, then we will mark that voter's record to indicate that the voter is no longer with us. And so that voter, they're not gone, they're not expunged, they're not missing. They're still in the database with a record of the fact that we received this information, and that information said that the individual was deceased, and this is where it came from. And if that voter turns out to not be dead, if there turns out to be, some sort of a reason why the Social Security Administration had their data wrong, and that voter comes and votes a provisional ballot, we will unwind that. We will count the provisional ballot. We will make the correction to the file. So we always have a paper trail to be able to go back to on changes like that. Now, generally speaking, the way the process works, that voter will be registered unless we receive a source of information, at that level, like a Social Security death record telling us that that voter needs to be taken off of the rolls immediately. But again, they're not really taken off. They're marked as canceled. But the more common situation that voters are concerned about is voters being inactivated and then taken off the rolls. And that only happens in the state of Maryland. Different states have different laws. That really only happens in the state of Maryland when we receive information, first of all, that says that you're no longer there. We do not inactivate voters merely for not voting. We only take a voter off the rolls if we get a returned piece of mail, or we get one of those other formal sources of data that says that the voter no longer lives at the address that they're registered. And so that triggers the beginning of a process where we mark that voter as inactivated. We send a notification both to their old address and to their new address if we have one. And over the course of the next 2 federal cycles, that voter can go ahead and update their registration. That voter can contact us. That voter can just show up and vote. And then they'll sign an affirmation saying that I do in fact live at this address, and that'll reset their status to active. So it's really only after we have information that we can point to, and we have a paper trail of it in our file that shows what information we received that said that that voter is no longer at that address, that they become inactive, and then they really have 4 years before they would, from that point, be marked as canceled. Again, able to be restored back if we find out that the information that we received was an error. I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Our next question, I think for Joanne, do you have any insight at this point into the House's views about possibly changing the number of days before the election when the mail-in vote canvass can begin? I believe your organization supported 18 days prior. If that's incorrect, please correct me. But why do you think the House did not agree with that number?
Yeah, I mean, we supported MAEO's recommendation of 18 days, but we obviously also supported, 14 days as well. I can't give you a concrete answer. I think if we really understood, we would have passed House Bill 1047. I think there's a combination there of the House not feeling as though there's going to be an overwhelming number of voters who will vote by mail. I had to remind them that we're mailing out ballot request forms and that there is a possibility we could get near 50%. Like, we really don't know as voters begin to see drop boxes or, as we're sharing messaging, there's a possibility that we kind of get up to that number. But I think their feeling was that there's not going to be a lot of people, even with a boost, voting by mail. I'm not sure if Allison knows if other issues were expressed, but honestly, I'm not clear what happened.
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier. I think they really just ran out of time, and they had so many bills occupying their attention at Sine Die that I don't know. I'm speculating because I wasn't there, and neither were you, obviously. But we were a little taken aback by it too, because we really had assumed that we would get that authority to open the ballots earlier, and it was a little bit of a surprise when that started to unravel.
We do plan on supporting it again next year. I think we're going to try and package it the way that it is, tracking, curing, and the early canvas, maybe meeting them halfway. We kind of tried to compromise and get them down to 5 or 7 days, knowing that we'd need to increase the number of days in future sessions. So my hope is that Delegate Wilkins, and possibly Senator Kagan will kind of work with us next session on some compromise.
Thank you. There was a link shared in the Q&A to the Brennan Center's list of state voting bills that are in play right now. Joanne, do you mind maybe just sort of, again, kind of summarizing some of the few that are still in play in Maryland for anyone who maybe missed it earlier on in the presentation?
Yeah, I mean, Sine Die was last week. So at this point, all of these horrible bills, they're dead at, I hate saying dead, but they've died at this point. So they would need to be reintroduced next session, so next January. So thankfully, we've only managed to pass really good reforms that expand access to the franchise. None of the bad bills, and I shouldn't say bad bills, but again, things that are aimed at addressing things like ballot harvesting, they didn't move out of committee.
Great, thank you. Our next question, is there any new voting equipment that is expected to be purchased for 2022, or will there be any enhancements to the elections budget for that year?
The one major procurement that the State Board of Elections has underway right now is an upgrade to the electronic poll books that we use to check in voters. The tablets that you see the election judge sitting there with when they check you in, which are, we procured those in, I think, 2005. And so, they're about as old as the Palm Pilot that I have sitting in a drawer over here. So it's time for us to upgrade those to, more of an iPad era device. And that's underway right now. The State Board is managing a procurement to try to get new devices in place for the 2022 election. That's really the only major procurement we see right now.
Great. Our next question, and I think this may be our last question for the evening. If the League of Women Voters for Montgomery County were to ask the Board of Elections if they wanted to work together on creating any kind of step-by-step videos or other media in order to better explain the voting process, is that something that the County Board of Election would be interested in doing with our organization? But just also in general, what would it really take to get a sort of step-by-step explainer put together that way?
So my short and general answer is sure. I mean, I'm game. I'm sure Dr. Z's game to work with you on, on conveying messages that, clearly there's sort of a lot of thought that's gone into that question. I'm not sure which process or processes the questioner is thinking of in terms of step-by-step videos, but I'm sure that, whatever they're thinking of is probably something that that we can work with them to craft.
About how far in advance of elections would you typically look for outreach community partners to help with the public education aspect of voter registration and getting ballots and et cetera?
Year round. The voters are shockingly not all as engaged in this stuff as we are. And so there's kind of there's a certain window of time when we can sort of count on the media having a high level of interest in, really working aggressively with us to get certain kinds of messages out, when we can more reliably expect voters to tune in. And so that will guide the timing of us putting certain kinds of information out. And certainly if there's a process that's being changed where we might have some state regulations that, that need to be written on something, then that may cause us to need to stop for a bit on how we're going to roll out something that we don't have total control over. But with those two caveats, voter engagement is a year-round activity. And it's something that we're very committed to, and it's something that we really see the benefits of when it comes to election time. And we have engaged citizens like yourselves who have been tuned in and have been listening to these things and having these kinds of dialogues year round, so that, when it's crunch time, you're able to help us get the word out and knowledgeably, answer voters' questions and help us out with that.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to, at this point, turn it back over to Lena.
Thank you so much, Amelia. And thank you, Allison and Joanne, for your very informative presentations and responses. I know that Joanne needed to jump off. So if you want to go, we all understand. Thank you so much for being here. You have to stay a little bit longer while I wrap up, Allison. But I did want to say thank you to both of you. This was an incredibly informative discussion that we've just had, and I really appreciate you both being here. I wanted to mention to the audience that we posted the BrennanCenter.org information, so that if you want to go on that and see what some of the states are doing, you can do that. And that's been posted by our technical person. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience who attended tonight. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the work of the League and Common Cause Maryland. We invite you to visit the League webpage at www.LWVMOCOMD.org, where you can find links to join or donate. Similarly, you can find information on Common Cause Maryland at www.commoncause.org/Maryland/. We wish you all good night, and we hope to see you at another one of our sessions. Thank you so much.